love it. Baruch Chaitz Nunigun. A Shavua Tov, a good vach to you, a good week. How's everybody doing? Great to be with you on a Saturday night, starting off our week with some beautiful learning. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us starting off the week on a Saturday night with beautiful Torah learning? Bill in Mid-Missouri, Gwen in Michigan, Harold in Portland, Nancy in North Carolina, Karen says Shavua Tov, Lucy in Minnesota, Stephen in New Hampshire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Paula saying Shabbat Shalom, Annie in Michigan, Heather in Kansas, Carrie in Santa Clarita, and John Boltman in Surfside Beach, South Carolina, the family beach. Bill, you're always in mid-Missouri. What is mid-Missouri? There's a town, right? Are you in a town? What's the town? Let me know. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by Gail Har, in memory of Elizabeth Anderson. May our learning tonight accrue to Elizabeth's merit, lift her up even a little higher in the world of souls. And Gail, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say Amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Okay, so I happen to go for Mincha Mariv, right, the afternoon and evening service with a little meal in between, where I usually go today, Yavne. It's actually a school and a shul, just a few blocks away from my house here in Hancock Park. And they're blessed with such a great rabbi, a good friend, Rabbi Shlomo Einhorn, who's just a brilliant and gifted teacher. He's been doing Daf Yomi for many years. And so tonight, for his little teaching between Mincha and Mariv, he did an overview of Seder Nashim, which is what we're doing now. We've just begun this sequence of tractates with Tractate Yevamos, and it's going to include Sota, Gittin, Nadarim, and Kiddushin, not in that order, but it's sort of the sages of the Talmud examining what are the relationships of families and marriage. And in his overview, he gave a few highlights of what's coming here in Tractate Yevamos. And he mentioned with respect to this learning that we're doing right now about how do we know that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a negative mitzvah unless the penalty of the negative mitzvah is very severe. So the example that we've been working with is that you cannot wear a garment made of wool and linen together, but if you have a linen garment and you're going to attach tzitzis to it, and it's going to have the blue dyed thread in it, which can only be wool, so you're going to attach wool to a linen garment, and so the positive commandment to wear tzitzis comes and overrides the negative commandment not to wear wool and linen together. Or you shall not shecht, you will not draw blood on Shabbos. That's slaughtering is the work of the week. But you would have a bris, you would have a circumcision on Shabbos. The positive mitzvah comes and overrides the negative commandment. So with respect to this general principle, Rabbi Einhorn brought down that the Ramban, right, Nachmanides teaches or taught, why do positive mitzvahs override negative mitzvahs? Thou shalt overrides thou shalt not, because thou shalt, the positive commandments, reflect thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and the negative commandments reflect yiras Hashem, fear of God, because fear of sin, which sin will be punished. Now, this idea of fearing God in modern times gets short shrift. We don't want to think about God being a judgmental and punishing God. We only want to talk about the loving aspect of God. But actually, to develop proper yiras Hashem, and a better translation of fear, I think it's often awe, A-W-E, that you should have awe of Hashem. But this idea that our judge in heaven, sees everything that we do and think, and we will be held accountable for all our good deeds and all our transgressions when we come before the heavenly throne for judgment when we leave this world. That is very proper, and to develop a good, a real sense of Yiras Hashem, of awe, is very important. So we shouldn't only have love of God, we must have fear of God as well. But at the end of the day, love of God goes even higher than fear of God. And we learned in Tractate Yuma, the laws of Yom Kippur, that one who makes a teshuvah, one who makes an atonement out of fear of God, because fearing that you will be judged, very holy, very important, and that will even turn your unintentional sins you'll be forgiven for them. But one who loves God and who makes a teshuvah, who makes an atonement because of his love of God, can turn even intentional sins, knowing sins, right, into mitzvahs, into merits, right? It's an amazing thing. So certainly you need both, right? You need both in healthy balance, but at the end of the day, just like chesed outweighs gevura, God's love and mercy toward us outweighs God's attribute of strict judgment. So too, our love of God should outweigh by a hair our fear of God. And as we talk today about this derivation of our sages, which we're continuing today, of how do we know that a positive mitzvah comes and outweighs a negative commandment, which here, why does it matter, right? Because in the yibum situation where a man dies who's married but childless and he has a brother, so normally his brother's not allowed, you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife. Any woman who was your brother's wife, even if she's no longer your brother's wife because you died, your brother can't marry her. Excuse me. But in the yibum situation, now the Torah gives a positive mitzvah that the brother should step in to continue his dead brother's line and give, a safety net, as it were, to the widow. He should step in and marry her, or the two of them can choose not to, but then they do Halita, this ceremony, which frees them from each other, but is also a positive mitzvah. And by the way, as we'll see, the chalitza ceremony, in which the woman removes the sandal, as it were, from the man's foot, is tied to, and I learned this from Rabbi Einhorn tonight, is tied to the story of Abraham going to rescue his nephew Lot in that war of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings in the book of Genesis. And when Abraham comes back victorious from fighting that war, one of those kings says to Abraham, take all the booty that you want. And Abraham says, nothing. I will take nothing. It should not be said that you enriched me in any way, not even a shoe strap, right? Not even a shoe strap. Because I did this just to save my nephew, taking care of my family. That value, taking care of your family, your immediate family, your extended family, and the Jewish people, in a sense, are one big extended family. But taking care of your family is such a major, major value. And because Abraham and his descendants should possess that quality, they merited to have the mitzvah of chalitza in their midst. This ceremony which, frees the widow to marry someone else if she would not marry her dead husband's brother. All right, let's continue. We pick this up at the bottom of 4b. So returning to our question, the Gemara explains the mention of wool and linen, right? We've been deriving this on the prohibition of wearing wool and linen together, but we still wear ritual fringes, tzitzis, even when it means putting a wool thread on a linen garment. And the mention in the Torah of both wool and linen is necessary, as it could enter your mind to state an argument in accordance with the opinion of Rava. As Rava raised a contradiction from the following verse, it is written that they make themselves fringes on the corners of their garments. Numbers 15:38. That's part of the Shema that we say every day. And the phrase "the corners" indicates that it must be from the same type of thread as the corner, i.e., the threads of the fringes must consist of the same kind of material as the corner of the garment. And yet it is written in Deuteronomy 22:11, wool and linen, which indicates that ritual fringes may be prepared from only those materials and no others. We've also been looking at how the sages will derive laws from the written Torah that aren't explicitly mentioned in the Torah. And we were discussing yesterday that one of those methods is juxtaposition. And so in Deuteronomy, as we've seen, don't wear wool and linen together, juxtapose with the tied fringes on the garment is to tell you that tzitzis overrides shatnez. And now we're sort of examining that a little bit deeper, and you might have thought that, okay, well, if you're, for example, wearing a silk garment, that the tzitzis on it should be made out of silk. And this mention of wool and linen, when this command is given again in Deuteronomy, is to tell you that the tzitzis can be made of the same material, or wool and linen, or wool or linen. How so? How can this contradiction be resolved? Fringes made of wood, wool, and linen fulfill the obligation of tzitzis, ritual fringes, whether the clothing is of the same type of material, i.e. wool or linen, or whether it is not of the same type of fabric. Conversely, with regard to all other kinds of material, if the ritual fringes are of the same kind, for example, silk fringes on silk clothing, they fulfill the obligation. But if the cloth is not of the same type, they do not fulfill the obligation of ritual fringes. If your garment is made out of hemp, you could put wool or linen tzitzis on it, but you cannot put silk tzitzis on it. Consequently, were it not for the and you could put hemp tzitzis on it. Consequently, were it not for the phrase wool and linen, it would have been necessary to prepare ritual fringes from the same material as the garment itself, even when using wool or linen, which is not the case. By the way, yesterday somebody mentioned, I think it was Sharon, this idea that in modern cotton was not available to them in ancient times. It is now. So if you wear cotton and wool or cotton and linen, or does cotton get treated like linen for the prohibition on shatnez? No. So wool and linen, very specific. Even goat's hair is not considered wool when you're talking about shatnez, that you can't mix wool and linen. It's really just wool and linen. Cotton is neither wool nor linen. Synthetic fabrics are neither wool nor linen, so they don't trigger the shatnez prohibition. The Gemara asks, but the Tana from the school of Rabbi Yishmael does not maintain in accordance with this opinion of Rava, since the Tana holds that there is no obligation to place ritual fringes on clothing that is not made of wool or linen. And the reason is that when the Torah speaks of garments, it is referring exclusively to clothes made of wool or linen. Consequently, Rava's interpretation with regard to different types of material does not apply to the opinion of the Tana, the Rabbi of the Mishnah, from the school of Rabbi Yishmael. And the Gemara responds, it is nevertheless necessary to state wool and linen, as it could enter your mind to say, in accordance with the inference of Rava, that the phrase, the corners, indicates that it must be from the same type of thread as the corner, but in a different manner. And this is what the Merciful One is saying, prepare for it wool fringes for a wool garment and linen fringes for a linen garment. And when you prepare wool fringes for wool clothing, then you dye it sky blue. However, if you prepare wool fringes for linen garments or linen for wool clothing, you need not include the sky blue thread. This is not what the law is. They're saying an interpretation could have been like that. Therefore, the Merciful One states wool and linen, which teaches that one fulfills the obligation of tzitzis, fringes, even with wool fringes for a linen garment or linen fringes for a woolen garment. Now we're at the top of 5a. And as I mentioned yesterday, the reason that most people wearing tzitzis today don't have the blue string in it is because at a certain point in ancient history, we lost the snail that we got the blue ink from, or it became prohibitively expensive, and the sages said, all right, the fringes are all white, and that's the way it was for many centuries. In modern times, there is an opinion that we have found the correct blue ink again, and people are starting to wear, a blue thread in their tzitzis, but that is by no means universal. It's still a minority that wear the blue. I do. There's high-level permit to do that, but it's still minority in the Orthodox Jewish world. Okay, the Gemara comments. So this works out, this view of why wool and linen are included in these commandments in the Torah works out well with regard to that which the school of Rabbi Ishmael taught, that all garments mentioned in the Torah are composed of linen or wool. However, according to the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with that which the school of Ishmael taught, who do not accept this opinion, from where do they derive the principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah? We're back to this question. As stated previously, the conclusion that the positive mitzvah to place fringes on a garment overrides the prohibition against mixing linen and wool is derived from a free expression, a free phrase, right? A phrase that is unnecessary in this verse, and therefore it is free for the rabbis to come in and interpret a law from it. It is derived from a free expression in a biblical verse. However, the expression is free for interpretation only in the opinion of the Tana from the school of Rabbi Ishmael. So then how do the rabbis who disagree with the Academy of Rabbi Ishmael derive that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah? And the Gemara responds, they derive it from the verse mentioned with regard to the laws of the purification of a mitzorah. The mitzorah is the one who has tzara'as, the skin outbreak, which is a physical expression of a spiritual malady. And when he when he sort of gets to the end of that condition, is cured from it, and has to go through a purification process before he can rejoin the community. So we learn at Leviticus 14:9, and it shall be on the seventh day that he shall shave all his hair off his head and his beard and his eyebrows, even all his hair he shall shave off. It was not easy to be a mitzorah, right? So you come to the end of being impure, and when you're walking around, you have to tell people you're impure because you are a source of ritual impurity. Then you get through all of that. You no longer have the skin outbreak, but now you have to go through that purification process, which includes not only immersing in a mikveh, but shaving off all your hair and bringing offerings, right? This is only when the temple is standing. And therefore, when the temple fell, there's no more tzara'as, and there's no more shaving like this at the end of the process. As it is taught in a baraisa, since it states all his hair, what is the meaning when the verse states his head? Why does he have to say shave off all his hair from his head? It already says shave off all his hair. Why is his head included in that? And the baraisa explains that as it is stated in Leviticus 19:27, you shall not round the corners of your heads, i.e. it is prohibited to shave the corners of the head. So I would derive that even a leper, a mitzorah, is included in this prohibition, right? You would have thought that we have a law, right? So, and you see that in modern times, from Yidden, right? Like very Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews have slightly different interpretations in different communities of what it means that you shall not round the corners of your head. Some say that's the payas, and they have the long side locks, right, which they never cut in order to fulfill this command. And others say it's not, no, you don't need the payas. It's just that when you have a haircut, you're never going to fully shave off the sideburns area right over here. At any rate, you're never going to shave the corners of your head, but the mitzorah, as part of his purification process, has to shave off all the hair of his head. So that's a positive commandment coming to override a negative commandment. Therefore, the verse states explicitly his head, to teach that the mitzvah that a mitzorah must shave overrides the prohibition against rounding the corners of one's head by shaving. And the Gemara adds, and this rabbi holds that the shaving of the entire head is considered rounding. And some sages maintain that one violates the prohibition against rounding the corners of his head only when... Where'd I go? I was distracted for a moment. Only when he leaves some hair intact and removes the corners alone. Right? So some would have said, well, if you shave off all your head, you're not violating rounding the corners, because what that means is that you have hair on your head and you only round off the corners. Conversely, this rabbi holds that even when one removes all of the hair on the head, as a Mitzorah does when he performs his ritual shaving, as this act includes the corners, he thereby transgresses the prohibition against rounding the corners. And this demonstrates that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a prohibition, meaning a negative mitzvah. And the Gemara raises an objection against that claim. This proof can be refuted. What about the fact that the prohibition against rounding is specific in that this prohibition is not equally applicable for all, as it does not apply to women, and therefore other cases cannot be derived from it? Now, you might have leveled the same charge about the fringes, right? Do women wear tzitzis? Women don't wear tzitzis. But in this case, let's see, it's for sure women aren't doing this, right? They don't have beards. And they don't do this. So one cannot learn from this law that a positive mitzvah applies only one cannot learn from this law that a positive mitzvah that applies only to some people overrides even a prohibition that applies equally to all people. Rather, the Gemara provides an alternative suggestion. The principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah is derived from the superfluous phrase, his beard. Leviticus 14:9, as it is taught in a different baraisa, what is the meaning when the verse states his beard? After all, a beard is already included in the phrase all his hair. Same idea, the Mitzvah has to shave off all his hair, and they mention his beard. But if he has to shave off all his hair, why does the Torah need to mention his beard? As it is stated with regard to priests in Leviticus 21:5, neither shall they shave off the corners of their beard. So I would derive that even a Mitzorah who is a priest is included in this prohibition against shaving his beard. Therefore, the verse states his beard in the case of the Mitzorah. However, the shaving of one's beard is also a prohibition that is not equally applicable for all, as it does not apply to women. Therefore, it is necessary to develop this argument further. And if the derivation from the term his beard is not referring to the matter of a prohibition that is not equally applicable for all, as the principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah that does not apply equally for all has already been derived from the phrase his head that we just went through, then the repetition of this specific scenario must serve to expand upon the teaching. Since we just went through that with respect to you're not allowed to shave off the corners of your head, but the Mitzorah does, and that doesn't apply to women, but we do it anyway. And now we bring this other example of a priest can't shave their beard, but the Mitzorah does have to cut off all his hair. It must be that the two cases are given in the Torah to teach you that you can learn out from one of the cases something additional. What do we learn? That a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a negative mitzvah. The specific scenario must serve to expand upon the teaching. Consequently, refer it to the matter of a prohibition that is equally applicable for all, i.e. that a positive mitzvah that is not equally applicable for all overrides even prohibitions that apply equally to all people. But the Gemara rejects this proof, not good enough. Still, it is necessary for the verse to state his beard. This verse is not, in fact, superfluous. It's not extra. It's not free to bring to interpret other laws from it, as it has a novelty. It's needed. Why? It could enter your mind to say that priests are different. Since the verse includes for them additional commandments, it is appropriate to be more stringent with them. And therefore, one might think that a positive mitzvah should not even override a negative mitzvah that is not equally applicable for all. Consequently, the verse states his beard, and it thereby teaches us that even with regard to priests, a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition that is not equally applicable for all. And this means that the principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah that is equally applicable for all people cannot be derived from this example of the Mitzorah who has to shave off all his hair, even if he's a priest who can't shave his beard, and even if he's a person who can't cut off his hair. So rather, the Gemara rejects this line of reasoning in favor of an alternative answer. The principle that a positive mitzvah, and remember, keep that spiritual teaching from the Ramban in mind, the positive mitzvahs reflect our love of God, which over at the end of the day trumps even our fear of God, right? So rather, the principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition is derived from a different interpretation of the phrase his head. We're still dealing with this, cited by this Tana. As it is taught in a baraisa with regard to the verse, he shall shave off all his hair. He shall shave all his hair off his head. What is the meaning when the verse states his head? The Bryce explains as it's stated with regard to a Nazir. So the Nazir is the one who took a vow that he would not benefit from the grapevine in any way for the length of the Naziris, right? For the length of the days that he is vowing to be a Nazir. He will not benefit from the grapevine. He won't drink wine, obviously, but he won't even eat grapes or take any other benefit. And he will not cut his hair all the days that he is a Nazir. And then at the end of his Naziris, he brings certain offerings. So now we're comparing this purification process of the Mitzorah at the end of being a Mitzorah to the vow taken by a Nazir and the offerings and immersion he has to do at the end of his Naziris. Okay, let's see. So it's derived from a different interpretation of the phrase his head, as cited by this Tana. As it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse, he shall shave all his hair off his head. What is the meaning when the verse states his head? The Baraisa explains, as it is stated with regard to a Nazir, no razor shall come upon his head. Now, I would derive that even a Mitzorah who is a Nazir is prohibited from shaving his head upon purification, right? If he happens to be, so he was already a Mitzorah, he had already taken a vow of Naziris, so he can't cut his hair according to his own vow, which he must follow. Then he became a Mitzorah. Then the tzara'as went away. Now he's doing his purification, and he has to shave off all his hair. But because of his Naziris vow, he can't shave his hair. So what do we do? Right? Positive mitzvah in conflict with a negative mitzvah. So what do we do with him? So I would derive that even a Mitzorah who is a Nazir is prohibited from shaving his head upon purification. Therefore, the verse states his head. And this teaches that the positive mitzvah for a Mitzorah to shave overrides the prohibition of a Nazir. The Gemara responds, no, this proof is not going to cut it. This can be refuted as well. What about the fact that the prohibition of a Nazir is not especially severe, as a Nazir who's also a Mitzorah can request to have his vow of Naziris dissolved by a sage? Since he can nullify the prohibition against shaving, it's not that everyone is prohibited to shave, only a Nazir because he took a vow, and he can get that vow nullified. He can go to a sage, a competent, qualified sage, and say to him, if I had known that I would be in this situation, I wouldn't have taken the vow, and then the sage will release him from his vow. So it's not like an absolute restriction on him that he cannot shave. This is not going to work as the source of our proof. Since he can nullify the prohibition against shaving, this prohibition is evidently not very severe, and therefore one cannot prove anything with regard to all of the prohibitions of the Torah that positive mitzvahs override negative mitzvahs. And the Gemara adds, as if you do not say this, that the prohibitions of a Nazir are not as severe as other prohibitions, that halakhic ruling that we maintain that a positive mitzvah does not override both a prohibition and a positive mitzvah would be negated. Why are we bringing that in, right? So we see that the positive mitzvah generally will override the negative mitzvah, but it won't override a negative mitzvah which is coupled with a different positive mitzvah. And the Gemara explains, let us derive the opposite of this principle from the case of the Nazir. As in this case, the positive mitzvah for a Mitzorah to shave apparently overrides both the positive mitzvah for a Nazir to grow his hair and the negative mitzvah against shaving. Rather, what is the reason that we do not derive this principle from the case of the Nazir? The reason is that there is room to refute this proof in the aforementioned manner. One cannot learn from a Nazir, as a Nazir who becomes a Mitzorah can request to have his Naziris vow dissolved. So too, there is room to refute the proof from the law of the Nazir that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition, as he can request to have his vow dissolved. If so, no proof can be brought from the case of the Nazir. Rather, the Gemara offers a different explanation. We're on 5b. And they learn this from the first verse, which permits a mixture of diverse kinds of wool and linen in ritual fringes. Right? We tried some other phrases as the proof why a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah. It didn't work, so we're back to tzitzis, ritual fringes, and shatnez, the prohibition of wearing a wool and linen garment, a garment that is made of wool and linen together. As for the previous claim that in the opinion of the rabbis, the phrase wool and linen is not superfluous and therefore there is no cause to derive from the juxtaposed verses in Deuteronomy, the answer is as follows. If so, that no homiletical interpretation can be derived, no law can be derived from the juxtaposition of these verses, let the verse say only, you shall make fringes for yourself. Why do I need the expression twisted fringes? Conclude from this that this verse is free. A homiletical interpretation can be derived by the juxtaposition of verses due to this superfluous phrase. The Gemara raises a difficulty. This term, twisted fringes, comes to teach something different, and it is not free for interpretation. It comes to teach the measure of ritual fringes, i.e. the requisite number of strings for the fringes, as it is taught. Right, so we're accustomed that our tzitzis, right, it's 4 long strings basically that get doubled and they become 8, right? And there's one, and there's, a series of 10 knots, and in between the knots, there's the twisting. And thank you, Sharon, for reminding me of the numbers, right? What was it? It was, now I forget, but you put it in the comments last night. But the number of twists between knots and kind of standard, like the most common type of knots and twists when fringes are made. There's other systems that use different numbers. At any rate, there was an 8 in there, right? There weren't all odd numbers, right? So what is it? 5, 8, right? Or 5, 8, 11, and 13. I should just count so I should know. Anyway, I'm sorry. Okay. But anyway, the phrase twisted fringes is to teach us how many strings are included in tzitzis. Consequently, when the verse says twisted fringes in the plural, it is referring to, this term twisted fringes comes to teach the measure of ritual fringes, i.e. the requisite number of strings. As it is taught, twisted fringe in the singular indicates that it is entwined, which requires at least 2 strings. Consequently, when the verse says, that's it. The 5 knots, 7, 8, 11, and 13 winds. Thank you, Sharon. Okay. So how do we know that there's 4 strings? Because it's called twisted fringes. That means there has to be 2. Twisted fringe means 2. Twisted fringes means 2 sets of 2. And that's how we know there are 4 strings that are going to end up being knotted 5 times with the 7, 8, 11, and 13 winds between the knots. The Gemara responds, if so, that this phrase is not extraneous at all, and therefore cannot be used as a homiletical interpretation by the juxtaposition of the verses, well then let the verse say merely, you shall not wear diverse kinds, shatnez. Why do I need the verse to add the phrase wool and linen together? Conclude from this that the phrase is free, and therefore we can make a homiletical interpretation of the juxtaposition of shatnez and tzitzis. Gemara raises another difficulty, and still it is necessary for the verse to state wool and linen together to teach another law concerning diverse kinds. When one combines a woolen garment with a linen garment, if he stitches 2 stitches with a needle, this is considered attachment, but a single stitch is not attachment, and this law is derived from the term together, which indicates that they are attached as one. And the Gemara answers, if so, let the merciful one write, you shall not wear wool and linen together. Why do I need the verse to add the phrase diverse kinds? Conclude from this that the phrase is free so that we can make the juxtaposition argument that positive mitzvahs override negative. And the Gemara says, no. And still it is necessary for the verse to state diverse kinds, shatnez, as this is interpreted as an acronym that teaches that the law of diverse kinds applies only when it is smooth combed, sho'ah, spun, tavui, as a thread, and attached, noz. But without these characteristics, the connection is not considered diverse kinds. Rather, the Gemara explains that the entire interpretation is derived from the term diverse kinds, since the Torah uses the highly distinctive word shatnez. In addition to functioning as the above acronym, it serves as the source of the verbal analogy. With the term in the verse, neither shall there come upon you a garment of diverse kinds, shatnez, mingled together, Leviticus 19:19, from which it may be inferred that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition. we have found that a positive mitzvah overrides a regular prohibition. However, where do we find that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition that includes kares? All right, so the Gemara is now satisfied that from the juxtaposition of the commandment to wear fringes alongside the commandment not to wear a garment made of wool and linen together, that we know that your positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah. And we went through all the different refutations of why we don't have free phrases in those two verses that allow them to be interpreted in this way. The Gemara is satisfied. A positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah. However, if the negative mitzvah is severe enough, then the positive mitzvah will not come and uproot the negative mitzvah. How do we know that? We have found that a positive mitzvah overrides a regular prohibition. However, where do we find that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition that includes kares, as the phrase with her is necessary to prohibit her? Okay, so here, if it's sufficiently severe, it won't override. But this is pretty severe, right? So it is a punishable by kares that you will not marry your brother's your brother's wife, right? Even if your brother dies, you're not going to marry your brother's wife. But if he died childless and we have a yibum situation, you are obligated to marry her or perform Halita with her. So how do we know that this positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah, even a negative mitzvah which is punishable if you transgress it by death at the hands of the heavenly court? It was mentioned previously that the superfluous phrase with her teaches that the mitzvah of yibum does not override the prohibition against taking a wife's sister, right? So you can't end up with two women as your wives through a yibum situation if those two women are sisters. So there, the positive mitzvah doesn't override that negative mitzvah, which has a big penalty. However, why is this necessary? Why would it have been assumed that a positive mitzvah is so powerful that it overrides even a prohibition that is punishable by kares? And if you suggest an answer and say, let us derive this claim from the mitzvah of bris milah, circumcision, as there is a positive mitzvah to perform circumcision on the 8th day of the boy's life, even on Shabbos, even if the 8th day falls on Shabbos. And this mitzvah overrides the prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos, which is punishable by kares. What one could then respond, well, what about the fact that the bris, the circumcision, is an extremely important and even severe positive mitzvah, as 13 covenants were established over it. The term covenant, bris, is mentioned 13 times in the chapter of circumcision, right? The word for bris, the word for circumcision in Hebrew is covenant, right? And it's because God established a covenant with Abraham and his descendants forever, which would be symbolized by the fact that Jewish males are, altered in this way, or some would say finished, completed, that on the 8th day the foreskin is removed. And it's so important that the word covenant is mentioned with respect to this mitzvah 13 times in the passage where it is explained in the Torah. And the Gemara adds, and if you say that we derive it from a different place, that a positive mitzvah is going to come and override a negative mitzvah, even if the negative mitzvah is punishable by kares, and instead of one which is about the covenant, which is so important and such a strong positive mitzvah, let's look at a different positive mitzvah. So let's look at the Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, which overrides Shabbos also, right? So if the afternoon before Passover begins happens to be Shabbos, we're still going to shecht the Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, even though it's Shabbos, because we're commanded to slaughter the Pesach Lamb that afternoon, even if it's Shabbos. And it is therefore a positive mitzvah that overrides a prohibition punishable by kares. And this too can be rejected. What about the fact that the Paschal Lamb is different, as it is a positive mitzvah that is so severe that if you neglect to participate in the Pesach, that is punishable by kares for those who do not bring it, unlike all other positive mitzvahs. It's the only positive mitzvah with such a severe penalty for not observing it. And the Gemara offers yet another suggestion. So perhaps it is derived from the daily offering, right? The Tamid. When the temple is standing, there are daily offerings that are brought every day of the year, including Shabbos. which was slaughtered every day, even on Shabbos. This is a positive mitzvah that overrides the prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos, which is punishable by kares. And the Gemara rejects this claim as well. Well, what about the fact that the daily offering is special? Because it is every day. Since the mitzvah of the daily offering is performed every day, it is perhaps especially important, whereas a positive mitzvah that applies only at certain times might not be so powerful as to override a severe negative prohibition, which entails a punishment of kares if you violate it. So the Gemara says, clearly, the principle cannot be derived from any single one of these cases. However, let it be derived from two of these cases combined together by analyzing their common features. And the Gemara asks, well, from which two cases can it be derived? If one would say that it can be derived from circumcision and the Paschal lamb, the factor common to both of them is the particular severity, as their neglect entails kares. If one would seek to derive this from the Paschal lamb and the Tami, the daily offering, these have a different common factor, as both are a requirement of the altar in the temple, not for personal benefit. Likewise, if one would suggest deriving the principle from circumcision and the daily offering, this too must be rejected, as both of these mitzvahs were known by the Jewish people before the word of God was revealed at Mount Sinai. Right? The bris, right, the circumcision goes back to Abraham long before the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. The daily offering? Wait a minute. The Torah told us to bring a daily offering on God's altar, first in the tabernacle in the wilderness and later when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. How can you say the daily offering preceded the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai? Well, this is according to the opinion of the one who said that the burnt offering brought by the Jewish people in the desert was the daily offering. It wasn't that it preceded it by centuries or decades or years, but once the children of Israel left Egypt, they already made the burnt offering that became the Tamid even before the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. And moreover, from all of these together, i.e. circumcision, the Paschal lamb, the daily offering, it is also not possible to derive a conclusion, as all three of these were known before the word of God was revealed. So if so, no principle can be derived from these three mitzvahs. Rather, the Gemara suggests an alternative explanation, the inference from with her, right, that you're going to marry your brother's widow, even though normally marrying your brother's wife is a kares-bearing penalty, but in Yibum situation you do it, but you don't do it if marrying your brother's widow would leave you with two wives who are sisters. So here we go, with her is necessary, as were it not for this inference, it might be assumed that the mitzvah of Yibum overrides the prohibition against marrying one's wife's sister, despite the fact that this prohibition incurs kares, since it could enter your mind to say that this law is derived from the mitzvah of honoring one's father and mother. Okay, that's one of the 10 commandments. How does this come into play? As it is taught in a Baraisa, one might have thought that honoring one's father and mother overrides Shabbos. Therefore, the verse states, you shall fear every man, his mother, and his father. You shall keep my Shabboses. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 19:3. The Baraisa explains the derivation from the verse, all of you, both parent and child, are obligated in my honor, meaning God's honor, and therefore honoring one's parents does not override the honor of God, who commanded the Jewish people to keep Shabbos. And the Gemara explains, what? Is it not referring to a situation where his father said to him, slaughter for me, cook for me, or any other labor prohibited on Shabbos on pain of kares? And the father said, do this on Shabbos. And the reason that the Merciful One specifically writes, keep my Shabboses, right? God doesn't say in the Torah, keep Shabbos. He says, keep my Shabboses, is to warn against violating the prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos, a transgression which incurs kares, for the purpose of honoring one's parents. It may therefore be inferred that if that was not so, the positive mitzvah would override Shabbos. It is therefore possible to deduce from here that in general, positive mitzvahs override even prohibitions that entail kares, and the Gemara rejects this proof. How does the Gemara reject this proof? Tune in tomorrow at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. let's go to questions. Bill, the town is Columbia. Bill always tells us he lives in mid-Missouri. The town is Columbia, Missouri, where one finds the University of Missouri. But as it's in the rough geographic center of the state, the common local name is Mid-Missouri, which also covers Jefferson City, the nearby state capital. Thank you so much. I love learning geography. My son and I, it's like a little passion. And we like to play the new game Wordle. Everyone's playing Wordle. We love it. We play it every day. And Joodle. People who are not familiar with this, it's a great little word game. Wordle, you just guess one word at a time and see which letters are in the mystery word. And then Joodle, Jewdle, is a 6-letter word. And Joodle is much harder than Wordle. Because Joodle, the word can be not only in English, but also Hebrew or Yiddish in, it's transliteration, right? Where it's like spelled out in English letters, even though those languages wouldn't use English letters. So it's very challenging, Joodle. That's a lot of fun, Joodle.com. And then now there's Worldle, right? So that's a geography game where you get the outlines of a country and you guess what country it is, and then it tells you, how many miles away and in what direction is the correct country. Anyway, Sharon, women mitzorah, so a woman with tzaras, are not required to go through the same purification. Did Miriam have to go outside the camp for purification? As I was speaking it, I was a little concerned because what is the deal when a woman was a mitzorah? Okay, sure, she had to go through purification for sure, but did she have to shave off all her hair at the end of it? And if so, is there any issue? Because I don't think women have the prohibition not to cut off all their hair, right? It definitely doesn't apply to women that they're not allowed to round the corners of their hair, and there's no beard in any case. We're not talking about modern, sensibilities of gender, but we're just talking about in Torah times. So, yeah, I'm wondering how that intersects. But at any rate, we're not deriving that the positive mitzvah overrides the negative mitzvah from the case of the purification of a mitzorah, which overrides don't shave the corners of your beard for the reasons that we saw. Rather, we end up deriving that proof from shatnez and tzitzis. So Yosef Shum has a comment. I read an article on the Chabad website where a reader asked a rabbi why the Halita ritual is so humiliating, right? So we're going to get to this, but if you choose not to do Yibum, you do Halita instead. So it publicly, right, the woman removes the shoe from the man and has to say, so is done to a man who will not, step up and continue his brother's line. Right, which would seem to be very humiliating. Now, these days, we still do Halita when this situation comes up. We don't do Yibum. So is the man being humiliated? Not at all. Like, it's done before a Beis Din, and sort of like these are the words as a formula that is recited, but it is in no way meant to humiliate the man. Still, the formula sounds like it should be humiliating. So says Yosef, from what I gather, the explanation is that this act of humiliation is like a death of sorts, an emotional type that would release the couple from obligation. Just looking for your opinion if you have a different outlook on it. Yeah, I mean, it's like, I think the words are meant to be a humiliation in the situation where the guy really ought to do it. And particularly in the ancient world where a woman who didn't remarry could be sort of stranded and really left in a lurch. But, then later, even in our text, we're going to encounter this on page 39, that the problem with Yibum is that if it's done with the wrong intention, the wrong kavana, as I mentioned earlier, that if the brother in any way was like attracted to his, former sister-in-law, and he's going to marry her not so much to build up the line of his brother who died childless, but just because he'd like to be with this woman, that somehow that negates the mitzvah of Yibum with a proper intention, and could lead to that child, being kind of like the child of adultery and therefore a mamzer. And to ensure that that's not going to be in play, the sages have said from ancient times forward, chalitza, much preferable. You shouldn't do yibum, you should do chalitza. So if they're saying you should do chalitza, what? This poor brother, the surviving brother, he lost his brother. He's bereft. He's in mourning. And it's sad for the whole family that this man died, that this poor widow was left alone, that this poor man lost his brother, and now he needs to be humiliated because he's doing what he's supposed to do to go through the chalitza ceremony. And that's why it becomes more of a formulaic ritual. It is a mitzvah, and it is a holy mitzvah, but we don't view it as a humiliation. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday night, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. A good vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you.